Og joining us on Zoom from Canada is Cecil Konijnendijk, professor at University of British Columbia in urban forestry. Cecil, can you hear us?
I can hear you extremely well, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, take it away. The stage is yours.
Wonderful, and I really did appreciate the song as well. Thank you, that was fantastic. Sorry I cannot be with you there in Oslo, one of Europe's and my favorite cities, I would say, and a very green city, so definitely a lot of nature there. Walrus or not, there's definitely a lot to see. And the focus of my talk today is really about some of the exciting things that are happening in urban nature, urban green spaces. And I know the title of your day is Unrest, right? Uro. And I would say there's a lot of unrest in terms of urban nature and urban green spaces, but I think a lot of that unrest is actually very positive. And what I heard also from the previous speaker, these are challenging times, but I think there's also reasons to be hopeful and to see that there's a lot of things happening where we individually, as landscape architects, as green space planners, can really contribute. So I would say that we are living in a time where we are in a new era for urban greening. And I just show you this little picture from the Floriade, the horticulture exhibition in the Netherlands last summer. Of course, we talk a lot about greening, not just cities, but we talk about greening buildings. We talk about greening people's minds. We talk about bringing the connection to nature back to people if that has been lost. And when we talk about Scandinavian countries, of course, you have a very long tradition of being close to nature, of having cottages, or bringing children out to the forest. But in other countries, like in the Netherlands or in the UK, this is much less common, and there's really a need to kind of reconnect people and nature. And I think, to be honest, to make a connection to the previous speaker, we need that connection where we live in cities in order to really make people also aware of the wider need to protect nature and to protect the rainforest. And we know from research that people who grew up in natural environments, in green environments, also in cities, they will also behave more naturally friendly, more ecologically friendly. So we have really a good case to make here. And there's, of course, quite a lot happening in terms of some of the trends. So we have, of course, seen things like climate change. We see things like extreme weather events, water scarcity, but also public health challenges. So there's quite a lot of issues around, for example, mental health, increase of medication, for example, amongst children and teenagers. And of course, also cities in the global south that are really faced with poverty, with bad planning systems. And some of these trends are very long term, like, for example, climate change, biodiversity loss, but we can actually sometimes see them on a day-to-day basis when there are extreme weather events in terms of public health, of course, the whole COVID-19 pandemic that really confronted us with the consequences of our lifestyles and zoonotic diseases and so. So I think here we can, of course, look at it in two ways. We can see the glass as half empty, and we can see the glass as half full. And I will take a positive and optimistic perspective in terms of green spaces and nature in cities. Because I do think that these challenges actually have opened up a whole array of new opportunities for our field, for greening of cities. There is a reappreciation of nearby nature, and what some people have called a re-entanglement with nature. There's really a push towards more nature-based thinking and nature-based approaches. Of course, there's also an awareness about the role that green can play in adapting cities to climate change, and generally a mainstreaming, I would say, of green spaces into urban politics and urban planning and design. But of course, this also requires good governance, good leadership, and we have to train experts that are able to not just work in the green field, but actually are able to cross over into engineering, into planning, into urban design, into architecture. So it actually does put quite some demands on us professionals as well. And there's some really exciting research coming out these days. Maybe one of the most exciting pieces of work I've seen in the recent years is this study by IS Global in Barcelona. They did work in over 50 European cities looking at urban tree canopy cover and the number of people who die during heat waves, so the extra deaths that happen during heat waves. And they found in their research, if cities will reach 30% tree canopy cover, you can cut the number of excess deaths by 1/3. And that's, of course, very dramatic, right? If you think about heat waves we have had in Europe a few years ago, for example, in Paris, there were hundreds, if not thousands of people who actually died because of the heat wave. So if you can cut those numbers by 1/3 by enhancing tree canopy cover, then you can really make an impact. And this kind of evidence, of course, is coming home to politicians. And we see that now across the world that politicians are taking action and are turning also to trees and green spaces for fighting the impacts of climate change. A really good example of that is the United States. I think the previous speaker already alluded to that. President Biden's administration has accepted or adopted this Inflation Reduction Act. And one of the big actions under that Inflation Reduction Act is to adapt especially vulnerable urban communities to the effects of climate change and global warming and urban heat islands. And they just announced a support package of $1.5 billion going to tree planting and management in cities. So urban forests, as we call these, are really becoming a tool for keeping our cities livable and resilient. The European Union, of course, Norway is not a member, but is actually very closely aligned to a lot of the policies, has, of course, adopted its Green Deal program, where there's a lot of focus on green spaces. And actually, there's a new nature restoration law in the works to be adopted that for the first time sets a target for cities in terms of urban tree canopy. It says that every city in Europe should have at least 10% tree canopy by the year 2050. Well, no, this may not sound very ambitious, but the very fact that actually the European Union now sets a standard and says cities have to have a certain amount of green spaces and they should fight loss of green spaces is actually a very major achievement. So what is then happening at the national or the local level, I should say? Well, at the local level, we have cities like Barcelona that are doing some really exciting work. I lived in Barcelona for the last 2.5 years. I just left from there. But actually here, the whole idea of the super blocks is really a whole kind of paradigm shift in how we design our cities, take away car habitat and actually start creating more people and tree habitat. So the idea is here to take 3x3 blocks in the Exemple area of Barcelona, to close these blocks off for most of the traffic and to start greening the intersections by new public spaces. And this sounds great on paper, but actually if you go to Barcelona these days, this is how the streets are looking. So you see streets are really being taken away from cars, from parking spaces. More room is created for trees and more room is created for public space. And we know, of course, from cities like Paris, from Stockholm, from Zurich, wherever you can think, Oslo, that there's a lot of focus now of actually trying to bring more green, better green into people's living environments. And that then brings me to the core of my talk, which is really about planning guidelines and standards. And there's a call now, because of all these new developments, to develop clear guidance for how we can green our cities. How should we do this to promote climate, health, biodiversity benefits? And I did some work last year for the Nordic Council of Ministers. We created a very simple guidance for green space planning. And basically, the green space planning guidance is based around 4 very simple but very powerful principles. The idea of proximity, to make sure that green space is close to everybody, wherever we live. And this also includes visibility, because research shows that just seeing green and trees is already very good for our mental health and for our creativity. It's connectivity, of course, a very well-known term to connect green spaces, but also to connect people and green. It's diversity, so to make sure we not only offer a range, a diversity of green spaces, but also realize that people are different and there will be many ways in which we associate with urban nature. And then finally, very importantly, also equity. And equity relates to making sure there's a fair distribution of green and that everybody has access to good green, public green space, and also to the benefits of green space. So this can then be translated into, for example, guidelines to promote public health through green spaces. This is some work I did together with colleagues for the Flemish government in Belgium, where we identified different types of green that can be used to promote certain health benefits. And there's enough research these days that we can actually start saying, well, we have to promote things like tree canopy, community gardens, schoolyard greening. These are really some of the places where we can make the most health gains, you could say. So as another little contribution to the whole planning guidance, about 2 years ago, I came up with the idea of the 330-300 rule that I know also is discussed in Norway. And I know also NLA has been promoting this and talking about it as a way of bringing people close to nature, bringing nature close to people. So the idea is really that everybody should be able to see 3 large trees from their homes, but also from the places where they work and study. We should all live in a neighborhood with a canopy cover, a tree canopy of no less than 30%. And in line with the World Health Organization guidance, we should not live further away than 300 meters walk from a nearby public green space. So with this, we actually have visible green, we live in the green, and we have good access to usable recreational green. 330, 300. And I guess because it's also so easy to remember, and there's quite some evidence now to support, especially the 30 and the 300 part, this is really taking off very rapidly. And cities across the world, from St. Petersburg, Florida, to Malmö in Sweden, are now using it and adopting it and putting it to their policy and guidance. It's also used by organizations like Greenpeace and Nature Canada, and even UN organizations and the Nordic Council of Ministers have started recommending 330, 300 as a good guidance principle for greening cities. What I found very exciting is that the city of Malmö very recently in its new government decided to integrate 330, 300, not just in its green strategy, but in its översiktsplan, so in its general plan for the city. And actually the city of Kalmar in Sweden has done the same thing. And this is really a major step to bring green to a new level, to say, well, actually, this is basic infrastructure, this is critical infrastructure for the city, this is at the level of roads, water systems, all the other basic infrastructure that cities should have. So really a big step. I already mentioned organizations like Nature Canada are doing the same. They are recommending this, and they talk about bringing the tree canopy to everybody in Canada, which is also very exciting to see. Yeah, I've sometimes joked that I've been working now in urban forestry and greening cities for about 30 years. I've written a lot of books and publications, but maybe the highlight of my career was when I was featured in the French Cosmopolitan not so long ago, where the article said that if we can reach 330, 300, we can be happy 24 hours a day. And I thought it was really nice to see that these green issues are actually coming into even lifestyle and fashion magazines, because this is really the powerful aspect, I think, of communicating some of the great things that we do in our field and in our profession. So how do you then work with 330, 300? Well, you can actually develop maps. This is the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And here you can see how people are doing, how the city is doing for the 300-meter part of the rule. So you see the red areas, people don't have access within 300 meters to a park or green space. And the green areas, the dark green areas, the access is really good. And this is developed by a company called Konijnendijk in the Netherlands. They have done this for all municipalities in the Netherlands for 3, for 30, and 300. And these are, of course, very powerful maps for cities to use as well and to work with. And politicians have really taken action based on this. A question I often get then, of course, is, well, hey, great, but how do you do that, right? How do you do it in our dense cities where there's no space? But of course, we have some tools. We have tools like tiny forest, which are kind of tennis court size forests. We have community gardens, we have green roofs, we have green walls, but we have ways now to even bring green spaces into our most dense urban environments. And although, of course, the 30% should be trees, ideally, there's also opportunities to use other vegetation when it's really dense. But having said that, it's not enough to have planning guidance on a high level. And of course, these guidelines like 330, 300 are only a tool to really foster a debate and start also discussing with other professionals like planners and engineers, health professionals, etc. But we also have to anchor this in the local community. So we have to talk about stewardship and what I call nature-based stewardship. So how do we make sure that actually people engage with the greening of their streets, their neighborhoods as well? Well, here it's also important to use a kind of nature-based thinking approach, to give room to nature, space to nature, and natural processes in whatever we do in the city. Urban planning should really be also about using nature, working with nature, and not just controlling nature, but sometimes also letting nature go free. Working with cycling, working with ecological processes, having a biophilic mindset. And this is really starting to go beyond, let's say, the nature-based solutions discourse, but really trying to give agency to nature and to other species than humans in cities as well. I've been really influenced by some of the work on, for example, biophilic cities by Timothy Headley, but also by my colleague at UBC in Canada, Professor Suzanne Simard, who has, of course, done some really good research that shows that trees are communicating with each other underground, overground. They are communicating through different signals to different chemical substances, and they do that also between different species and not just within the city, within the species. And it shows that we have to think about trees in cities also in a very different way, not to put them in boxes or along streets with all the same genetic clone, but really to start thinking of cities as forests. And I know Oslo, of course, is not a bad example of how that could be done and could be taken further. And then it's also about rewilding of our cities, giving more space to nature, and also rewilding ourselves to bring nature again into our mindset, into our value systems, which will be a really important part of the equation. And there's some really interesting work done by designers, by landscape architects, by architects like Jean-François Gauthier, a colleague of mine in the Netherlands, who has the principle of trees first. So he says, first we have to make sure that we put in the right trees, the right soil into any new urban development. And from there on, we start thinking about buildings and we start thinking about infrastructure. Trees and soil should always come first. And he's now implementing this, testing this in smaller pilot projects in cities like The Hague. And I really like his kind of connection of the city and its ecosystem with the surrounding ecosystems as well as with culture and with the cultural dimensions of the local community. So I mentioned stewardship, and this is a bit of a rich slide, but stewardship is really, of course, about taking care of our environment, taking responsibility, not just for today and our current generation, but also for the future. And we have to foster a culture of stewardship that is not just city authorities managing green spaces and trees and gardens, but also local residents getting engaged and feeling that they actually have a role to play, taking care of their own environment, taking care of those nice trees, taking care of those nice gardens for all the benefits they provide. And this is really done, resulting in a lot of work in countries like the United States, where there's a project called StuMap that is mapping out like who are the stewards in New York City and other cities, which organizations are involved with managing trees and green spaces, what are the community groups, and how can we maybe start collaborating more between these groups, as cities usually only own a minority of the trees and green spaces in a city. Most of the green in a city is typically owned by private owners, by house owners, homeowners, etc. And there, of course, we work with concepts like placekeeping. So it's not about place making only, right? Creating something and say, this is it. But a place, of course, is really never finished. It is created in close connection between the local landscape and the local people. And this is where meaningful places are created. And this is a continuous process of management, of engagement, of community building that is really very closely connected to this idea of place and meaningful place. So I'm finishing up a book at the moment called Rethinking Urban Green Space, where I try to summarize some of those exciting things across the world happening with green spaces. And I'm trying to connect the idea of the 330-300, the top-down kind of planning approach with the bottom-up stewardship approach. And two of the concepts that I've introduced in the book is the concept of urban groves. And of course, groves are these kind of meaningful wooded landscapes for learning, for spirituality, sometimes for fruit producing, that we've had throughout our history as humans from ancient Greece all the way till today. But I think we can reinvent that term and start using it in our cities to create treed spaces with meaning, learning, spirituality, community connection. But also street woods, so to see every street basically as a small forest with the trees, with the vegetation connected to it, and engage local residents in creating these street woods, managing them, maybe watering trees during high summer temperatures, and really start feeling that this is actually also a friendly competition. We want to have the best street wood in Oslo, the best street wood in Amsterdam or in Vancouver. And I think a concept like this really will connect some of the big picture policies and thinking to the local stewardship idea as well. So finally, these are times of unrest, as you've heard already during the day, but I think these are really exciting times for green and trees and urban nature. I would say in my 30-year career now, this is definitely the moment where I see most opportunities for our field for re-engaging with urban nature, even though it is, of course, a very challenging time. And I think that evidence-based standards like 330-300 can help planning, but also help create a debate about the importance of trees and green spaces. And green infrastructure should really be seen as critical infrastructure. It's not an icing on the cake add-on. It's really something that should be there, and it should be well maintained and well planned. And then finally, we need also more nature-based, nature community-based stewardship and placekeeping, for example, through concepts like urban groves and street woods to have meaningful greening of our cities. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening and indulging in my story, and I wish you a very nice continuation of your VODAG. Thank you.